In 1959, the spaceship Explorer 6 took off from Cape Canaveral in Florida and took the first television shot of the Earth from space. Alaska and Hawaii would join the United States of America. In China, Chairman Mao was taking his great leap forward, which brought about the biggest famine known to China. Much to the joy of many, Western Germany was the first country in the world to introduce the 5-day working week. Fidel Castro is internationally recognized as the new leader of Cuba. Ben-Hur was the movie of the year, grossing $74 million, which was a lot of money in those days. The British Empire was ruled for a 6th year by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, and in Rome, John XXIII called for the Second Vatican Council. Earlier in the mid-40s, the founder of the Legionaries of Christ had stated his desire to found in Ireland, and now, at the end of 1959, 2 men arrived in a new land with a new mission. In 1959, the Legion of Christ was just 18 years old. In human terms, a teenager. In historical terms, a mere infant. Up until now, all its members had been Spanish speakers, the majority of them from Mexico. There were houses in Mexico, Spain, and Italy, and at the time, just one functioning apostolate, a school in Mexico City called the Cumbres, or Highlands. The foundation in Ireland was going to be daring, to say the least. It signaled the first time the Legion was to break into a new non-Spanish speaking land. It was also the first time the Legion embarked on the active recruitment of older teenagers. Up until now, seminarians entered the minor seminary between the ages of 11 and 14. But possibly the greatest challenge of all for the Legion was poised by the huge cultural difference that existed between the Spanish-speaking world and the English-speaking world. On paper, it was all well and good to say that the Legion professed universal charity and that its mission was likewise universal. Another thing was to see if it really worked. There was, however, one factor that outweighed all these challenges. Ireland was profoundly Catholic, and as a nation for hundreds of years had been committed to sending missionaries far and wide to spread the gospel. It was to be this Irish missionary factor that opened up a whole new world for the fledgling Legion.
It was a normal thing to go to Africa to be a missionary. There's some moment along that it must be the Christian Brothers tell us about. John the 23rd is looking for priests for Latin America. Latin America is a Catholic continent that's been lost because of lack of priests. So there was this this wish of the Holy Father.
After an extended visit to Ireland in late 1959, James Quandreau and Alfonso Samaniego reported back that prospects were good. In 1960, the Bishop of Clogher, Monsignor Eugene Callahan, gave the Legion permission to have a house in Ireland. Bundrawa's house in Bundoran was rented, and the mission to found a house in Ireland had begun. Alfonso Samaniego was named superior of the new house, and James Quandreau was to spearhead the recruiting effort. And James Quandreau certainly knew how to cause an impression.
He used a nice hat, a lovely hat, and a big leather briefcase full of papers.
He had a rather unique, came in, took his coat off, threw it on a chair, opened his case, threw out the magazines and said, you know, there you have people who believe in something and they're doing something about it.
This dynamism, he was fast, he was making the most of his time. So I gave him my little yes paper in the morning, and that evening he was at my house to interview me.
On November the 6th, 1960, the first two Irish candidates, or postulants as they were called back then, received their uniforms. Pierce Allen and James Whiston. Father Neftali Sanchez was named superior of this new community. Although the earlier postulants were not novices, they did wear the uniform of a novice and followed what was, for all intents and purposes, a novitiate timetable. Over the next few months, the efforts of Father James were bearing fruit, and on the 5th of April 1961, the second group of young Irish men officially became postulants. Sean Keane, Morris McGowan, Declan French, and Francis Coleman. However, none of these first Irishmen would make the Legion their permanent home. It wasn't until almost 2 years after recruiting had begun in Ireland that people began to stick. Later that summer, Raymond Comiskey would also join. Unlike the previous postulants, this new group would not wear the uniform and would have a long wait before they became novices. Father Yepes, Ramiro Fernandez, and Angel Saiz were brought in to help.
Real enthusiastic about everything. Real positive, real enthusiastic, a real legionary. With a lot of zeal for souls, and he wanted to learn English, he wanted to be better prepared, no problems. Everything was for love of Christ and for souls, and Father Yepes was as they'd say in Spanish, encantador. He didn't speak English very well, but we understood him perfectly.
It was a large group, so large that some almost got left behind.
So I was expecting him to come on the 1st of July, as he told me. So I was waiting with my case packed, sitting at home the 1st of July, and he never came.
Thomas Moylan would eventually be collected, and in August 1961, he arrived to Bundrawa's house.
was a port. Yeah. I went with a vocation and with the idea that, well, if this is it, well, this is what I have to try. And the Lord will lead me on, so here I go. And I went with that attitude. I felt a little bit uneasy maybe the first week, something new, everything new maybe. But that just drifted away and I stayed on. Yeah, this was the recreation room. And we had here at Christmas time our Christmas room. And I remember we were here having our Christmas room and a seminarian came to visit us when we were postulants. So, and he said to me, he said, how is it you have this great atmosphere? He said, you know, in my seminary we don't have that. And we sort of didn't even understand, you know. We didn't know that we had a certain atmosphere. It was just what we'd been learning, I suppose, you know. Union and charity in our own imperfect way. We would play here, I think we had chess and drafts and music. We would have classical music on here. This is, the color scheme is all new here, of course. Yeah.
Maybe we'll see something here on the...
They changed all the rating.
A curtain hanging down.
And it was against the window because it was before the Vatican.
Yes,
the
it was.
mass with his back on.
Back to front, yeah.
We fitted well. There was no kneelers, it was just chairs.
Chairs, yeah.
In Bundoran, there was always a family atmosphere, beautiful family atmosphere that I found from day one. So they were very charitable, very kindly, very friendly. One of the things, there's a fact, there was the welcoming atmosphere, but it was also the kind of with your own companions in school, and you're already following your vocation. So there's certain things you're making sure to avoid, to live in grace. So suddenly you're with a group, as you could use the thing, band of brothers. Suddenly you have this fact that unites this group, and that was very helpful.
You just feel that this is your place. You feel at home in this place. The people who make you feel at home. The people receive you and they accept you as you are, and all of that helps an awful lot. You were like a fish in the water. That's the way I felt. Fish in my water, in my own pond.
I was the electrician, and we hung all the lighting of the one
bulb,
one connection,
one cable.
As soon as we switched it on, of course, the fuse blew.
Oh yeah, and there was another problem too,
we
because
had to get some electric light from outside.
Because a little afterwards, there was a short circuit, and everything went up, and at least in one corner went up in smoke.
Oh boy!
There was a little fire.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, but very
easy. Well, it wasn't your fault. No. Our age limit limits us to slowing down. Our pace has slowed down. When we were young, we came down here like...
You were young and handsome.
Yeah, came
You
down...
had some hair on your head.
Yeah, I had hair on my head. Yeah.
And what would you do when you came down here?
We would just bounce along from rocks.
Also, when the tide came in, we were in swimming trunks, and we would turn our backs to the incoming waves, hold on to the rocks, and just cling to them. And the waves would break over us, and they actually tried to, it was dangerous.
Of course, yes, this was a frequent area of short walks.
The summer of 1961 went on, and in August, some postulants from the first groups leave to begin their novitiate in Salamanca, Spain. Among them was Brian Farrell. While things might have been grand in Bundoran, there was a problem with the novitiate in Ireland. There wasn't one, and it wasn't for lack of candidates.
Oh, we didn't really know at the time. They were going by from November to the 3rd of January to the 6th of February, all significant dates in the history of the Legion.
There was some, shall we say, going through the mill in Bundoran because it was taking a long time for the novitiate to be founded. So I had decided that's enough. I'm going home. So I go up to Father Rector and I'm knocking at Father Neftali's door. And I'm knocking and I'm there for maybe 5-10 minutes and there's no answer. And the next day I can't remember what it was, but that has always been decisive for me through my life. I had taken for me a rash judgment that day. I took a rash decision. I wanted to go home. The next day, whatever it was, there was peace. So anytime afterwards, when anything comes, I just say, hold on, just give it time.
Then, in 1961, John Charles McQuaid, the Archbishop of Dublin, gave the legionaries permission to come to Dublin, but it took almost 6 months to get things ready in the nation's capital. By April 1962, it was time to say goodbye to Bundoran and to move on. It was time to found a novitiate. Malahide is a suburb to the north of Dublin City. His Grace John Charles McQuaid, along with Monsignor Robert Glennon, the Chancellor of the Archdiocese, were instrumental in finding a house for the legionaries here. The house was called Hazelbrook. When we visited Hazelbrook in the summer of 2011, it was obvious that the house had not had many official residents since the legionaries had been there many years before.
Yeah, this is not exactly safe.
At the very beginning, just before entering, I was surprised to see that the house was so small. I came from my home imagining some kind of a seminary, so I was expecting a kind of a building, or as my imagination always sort of saw a seminary. The
first months in Hazelbrook House were going to be rather hectic. The number of legionaries in Ireland was about to double. Back in May 1962, the priority now was to get the place ready for the novitiate.
And we fixed it up and we started from scratch, and it was small and it was very inadequate for what we were trying to do. And it made us, we had to put up with each other quite a lot.
The first 3 or 4 could open a tap and the water wouldn't get any further.
So if you wanted water, you had to get there in first, and the water was right there at the beginning. So I usually got to the washroom early because I had to shave. I shouldn't be bending like this. Oh!
A key benefactor in the Ireland Foundation was Doña Flora. Not only had this lady given a large donation that helped the Legion buy the property in Leopardstown, which in time would be the definitive site of the Ireland novitiate, but now in late 1962 she paid a visit to Hazelbrook House and offered to equip the novitiate chapel. The crucifix Donna Flora bought is now in the Centre for Higher Studies in Rome, and the statue of the Blessed Virgin still graces the novitiate chapel in Ireland. Late May also saw the blessing of what was soon to be the novitiate by His Grace John Charles McQuaid. Within 3 weeks of getting to Hazelbrook House, on June the 2nd, the postulants, who had been waiting more than 11 months for their uniforms, finished spiritual exercises. That evening, the founder of the Legionaries of Christ arrived in Malahide. The postulants were more than ready, and so just after midnight in the early hours of June the 3rd, the novitiate was born.
I think, above all, I think of the novitiate, because that's where we entered into the novitiate. We founded the novitiate on the 3rd of June 1962, and it was very memorable because our parents came, and it was a wonderful day.
And the novices had just 1 week to get the house ready for the postulants that were to arrive in July.
Because we were still sleeping inside, and we had to get out of there so as you could have the postulants could have the dorms.
There was something vaguely reminiscent going on here. The brothers were turning a stable into a dorm.
So we were living in a cowshed, exactly. That was our dorm. The dorm was the cowshed.
Vocations kept on coming, and the summer of 1962 saw a new batch arrive. Among this new group was Michael Ryan.
My experience, and I think I reflect the others, your vocation is not a decision, it's an answer. And I think that's the way we lived it.
That summer ended with a new group of novices. Among what were now called the first-year novices were Patrick Harrigan, Bernard Quinn, and Michael Ryan. In less than a year, notwithstanding all the alterations, Hazelbrook House was getting a little too small for the increasing numbers. The definitive novitiate in Leopardstown was still far from completion, and on April the 9th, 11 months after getting to Hazelbrook House in Malahide, it was time to move along once more. In less than 3 years, the Legion in Ireland had lived in 3 houses. But now the novitiate was up and running and new vocations were being found. In September 1963, a new group received the legionary uniform, among them John Cody and David Owen. The second-year novices in Dublin, among them John Devlin, Jude Furlong, Thomas Moylan, Donald Curry and Fintan Lawless, were not to profess in Dublin, though. In July 1963, they left their homeland bound for Salamanca, where they would profess their vows. It was not until mid-August the following year of 1964 that Ireland saw its first legionary profession. Among those to profess were Bernard Quinn, Patrick Corrigan and Michael Ryan. It was 1964 and the Second Vatican Council, called for in 1959 by Pope John XXIII, was in full swing. Near the end of August, the newly professed Irish legionaries left for Rome to help look after the council bishops who were living in the legionary centre in the Eternal City. And in September of that same year, back in Ireland, new recruits joined the Legion. Among them, Brian Wilson, Manus James McElhargy, John Joe Monaghan, and Anthony Bannon.
One thing that really struck me, that I thought about a lot at the time and then I've thought about a lot since, it seemed very new to me when we got to the novitiate, the insistence on a personal relationship with Christ. And bringing out the personal relationship and the personal decision sounded like a novelty to me.
This was new, totally new. And then when we learned more about it and it was about love, that meant even more.
By the mid-60s, it was clear that the challenges faced by the Legion in her foundation years in Ireland were being met. The new language, English, turned out not to be a wall, but a stepping stone. The ready response of the many young Irishmen proved that recruitment of young adults was not only possible, but also effective. And the universal charity promoted by the Church and by the Legion proved that cultural differences enrich more than they divide. In October 1968, the legionaries would move to the purpose-built and definitive site of the Ireland Novitiate in Leopardstown. And 1 year later, on the 10th of October 1969, this new building would be blessed by His Grace John Charles McQuaid, Archbishop of Dublin. And with this, we can say that the Legionaries' Novitiate in Ireland was well and truly founded.
Looking back on the history of what we've been looking at the last few days, his memory lane, there was a lot of manliness. There was a lot of kind of embracing. What do you want? It was a spiritual adventure. We're out there. This is a new adventure.
You know that there's a whole story behind each person and each situation, each house, etc. And it's full of, as I say, good things and things that were mistaken or whatever, or limitations of people. And in that sense, it keeps your feet on the ground. And in that sense, I would say that history helps you to love the Legion more. You become more realistic, you become more committed.
I think God's grace was definitely a major factor in that, and making up for a lot of human deficiencies, both in the directors. They're still in a very new culture, very new circumstances, probably suffering much more than we realized at the time. And then us were coming in very raw, but still very open to what God wanted.
I mean, what you do out of love, what you do for people, well, that's the meaning, I think, of our lives. I've learned also that to be happy means to be able to say that what you've lived was well lived. I think happiness is something that you see looking over your shoulder backwards.
And we were learning things and entering into a path that was leading us towards the future. Now we look back on that, and I think we are thankful for the fact that we've been faithful to that sort of yes, that simple yes in its own way, which has brought us also through difficulties and even failures and setbacks.
These early Irish legionaries are now all certainly getting on in years. In a strange way, they form part of what could be considered a new generation of legionaries, the over 65s. What do they say to one another?
I personally think what you would recommend, don't stop. Keep going. If you have to slow down, slow down.
I would say number one, I would say be very positive always. Be positive. And the second thing I would say is try to be active. Even though you may be curtailed physically by some ailment, be active mentally. And then of course, never let your spiritual fuel go low. But you know, try to have the same enthusiasm that you had when you were really very young.
And what do they say to the younger generations?
For future legionaries to be men of friendship with God, above all men of the Eucharist, to go to the Eucharist, to spend time. So when you get an assignment, whatever it is, you might get a letter, you go to the Eucharist and you open your heart to the Lord and ask His strength. And then you can open the letter and maybe it's saying, thank you for the report you sent me in. But it's once you bring these things to the Lord, you see it in a different grace. You have to be men of the Eucharist, very close. And then at the same time, they have to be close to the men that God has put in their life to guide them.
Over the 50 years that followed the foundation, Ireland was to undergo a radical change. The Irish, like so many other nations in the Western world, were now dancing to a new tune. One of the key players in the band was affluence, unexpected affluence. Values held so firmly for so many centuries now seemed to be slipping. If in the 50s and 60s it was Latin America that needed help to keep the faith, now in the new millennium, Ireland herself wasn't looking too good. One of the effects of this shift was the lack of vocations to the religious life and to the priesthood, and not only in Ireland. And as a consequence, in September 2011, the novitiate of the Legion of Christ in Ireland would close. It would appear that our look at the Ireland Foundation ends on a sad note.
It does point to a huge gap. And that gap, necessarily we have to think, is partly in the atmosphere, in the general situation of the church in Ireland. And we have to consider this possibly to our actions as well, or lack of action. For me, it's impossible. It's a contradiction. It just cannot be that God is sterility. He's not. So we have to look for that solution. So yes, there's a lot of thought, and it certainly is a commitment. But I think the situation that we've been in is not natural. It's not right. It's not reflective of God's plans. So we've got to get out there and do our part. But our part principally is by being faithful to God. So we've got to be more prayer, more fidelity, and then apostolic action.
As we ended our visit to the first houses of the foundation in Ireland, one thing stood out, at least for me. It was the dedication, the loyalty, enthusiasm, good humour, and sincere friendship that these men professed and profess still today. And so if these men are anything to go by, we can say that whatever the challenges ahead, the Legion is well equipped. For no matter what the venue, the Legion is her men.
Yes, I would. I'd do it again.